Thank you, John. That was an excellent introduction. And good morning, everyone. Sorry I can't be there in person, but hopefully you'll enjoy what I'm going to talk about this morning. I'm going to talk more about the vulnerabilities and the threats to GNSS. Firstly, what they are and the sort of impacts you can experience. Later on, this morning, I'm going to talk about how you can approach dealing and improving resilience, if you like, to those vulnerabilities through systems of systems thinking. Having a systems approach to dealing with this is really important. And then later on, again, I'll present a little case study from aviation where we see that if you don't apply those systems techniques to solving these problems, the consequences can be just as bad as not having any protection at all. Anyway, I'm sure, as I said, as I think John said earlier, we're keeping mathematics to a minimum. I haven't got any mathematical things to show you. But what I did want to share with you is a diagram that actually, it's a bit dated now, but John and I put this together way back in 2014, and you may have seen it around in a number of different places. It's been shared quite widely. And this is what, GNSS vulnerabilities we have to deal with are. And John has spoken about a few this morning. Specifically, he spoke and talked about multipath errors. He talked about the atmospheric problems such as solar weather, scintillation. What I'm going to talk about more and show you some examples of right now are spoofing, interference, cyber attacks, and what we call segment errors, which is where there's a system error in GNSS. And we have to think about all those things. Now, cyber attacks obviously apply to many systems, not just GNSS, but most of the problems that we're dealing with GNSS are due to the fact that GNSS has the low signal power, which is not unexpected because we know that the satellites are in medium Earth orbit. And that low signal power leads to a selection of different vulnerabilities. Now, these next few slides, I'm not going to go through them in detail. As we're sharing the slides with you following the talks, these are ones you can look at yourself. But what I attempted to do was to put the different vulnerabilities and possible sources of problems together in a table showing the description of the vulnerability, its frequency, and the sort of impacts you can expect on a user, which can be quite useful if you're troubleshooting. So these are really slides for you to read after my talk. Now, when we talk about the sort of direction that threats to GNSS can come from, they can come from a variety of people who we're familiar with for attacking IT networks. Everything from unstructured hackers to insiders, and insiders can bring not just a malicious attack, but also they can often be the source of human error and confusion about what they're trying to do or how systems are dependent on GNSS or PNT. We have to watch out for organized crime, industrial espionage, then terrorist groups and nation states. They can all cause disruption to GNSS for a variety of reasons. They are the same groups and the same type of group that threaten IT as well, and IT security. Right, I'm going to go through a few real world incidents now and impacts. Some of them will be unexpected and some of them you might have read about. I've got a huge catalogue of these incidents and events. I love collecting them because they quite often show unexpected motivations and unexpected consequences too. Because often when you're designing a system for a user, you think you understand the use case and the motivation of the user, but it turns out that perhaps you didn't do enough thinking in that regard. This one's a classic one of those. This was a situation where some GPS being used on commercial aircraft in China was jammed by a pig farm. And the pig farmer had been having problems with drones, which he thought were supposedly spreading African swine fever, which was becoming a bit of a problem to him. So although it sounds unlikely, this was the motivation. He decided that a good way to ward off these drones would be to jam their GPS systems. So that's what he did. Unfortunately for him, not understanding the full consequences of what he was doing, he also jammed the navigation systems of some overflying aircraft. And obviously the device was confiscated eventually after a huge number of reports about GPS signal loss. And so straight away, you can see some of the unexpected consequences and motivations and how wide the disruption is. Because of the weak signal strength of GPS, something like this one jammer on a pig farm was able to jam aircraft that were flying overhead. Obviously, that was a failure to understand, and he probably wasn't trying to jam commercial flights deliberately, but people are and do have that motivation. Criminals now. Here, this is a report from Mexico, where the Mexican government reported that in 85% of some thefts that they were evaluating, GPS jammers were routinely used. They were used in all of them, in fact. And this was for cargo truck thefts, not luxury cars. We know that jammers are often used to defeat trackers in luxury cars as well. This was cargo truck theft, so high value cargo, and they brought into force a new bit of legislation. And I've listed and gone into detail about the legislation here because, again, this is one of the protective mechanisms that you can use, and we'll see that later on. So they decided to try and protect this by bringing in and enforcing some very stringent legislation. This is another unexpected consequence, and actually we still don't know quite what happened, but a military drone inadvertently ended up spoofing a GPS system on a privately owned aircraft. The type of aircraft I've shown on this slide may not be the one that was involved in this. I don't know what type it was. The pilot's report, he saw this military drone pass overhead and then had problems with his navigation display, and had to cope with that. He managed to cope with the problems on his navigation display and landed in visual flight rules. So he had to stop referring to the navigation instrumentation on his flight deck. And to this day, we don't quite know what happened. It's obviously something on the drone interfered with the navigation equipment on the private aircraft, and the consequence, again, totally unexpected, an accidental problem, but again, it highlights the sorts of things we have to be careful about. And what I wanted to show there is that there are times when a military equipment will accidentally end up affecting civilian or commercial equipment. Another unintentional vector is one I found from France in February 2020. And this is where a malfunctioning internet modem jammed the Galileo signal. It says Galileo GPS signal, in fact, which is wrong. But that was the headline, not me. The ANFR, which is France's agency who look at these issues, had a look into this interference, which is being reported by people in the neighborhood. And they eventually found this pulsed interference, which was out-of-band interference. It wasn't on the GPS frequency, but it was affecting GNSS reception in a lot of the receivers that were around in that neighborhood. So it was obviously quite a powerful spike. And they eventually found the internet modem in an apartment which was owned by a resident who had no idea that their equipment was causing any problems at all. So again, this one I included because it shows as well that it may not necessarily be an in-band source of interference. Interference out of band, if it's powerful enough, can cause problems, especially in older GNSS receivers. So we've got a lot of things to start thinking about here. Here's an interesting one. In Tehran in 2020, crop circle spoofing was reported. And you may have read about some of these crop spoofing or crop circle spoofing incidents. They're quite widely publicized. This is one that was taking place in the center of Iran, which was reported to the US government's Coast Guard site. And it was backed up by some evidence from heat map data from a fitness application that shows that this circle spoofing has been employed in other locations. Now, I've got a theory about the cause of some of this spoofing that I might talk about a bit later on. In fact, I will talk about later on in a high level. I'm not sure that some of this spoofing is RF, and we'll talk about that later on. But this is an interesting one again. And also, I think it shows another issue, which sometimes we don't talk about enough in the industry, which is the importance of privacy of PNT related data. If it gets into the wrong hands, then the history of your whereabouts can be maliciously modified or amended. So there's something to bear in mind. We know that in Norway, commercial flights have been experiencing GPS jamming on and off. This has been caused by military exercises. And this has been going on for a while. It started in 2017, but Northern Norway and Finland have been receiving problems. The problems now in Ukraine mean that some of the jamming exercises that are going on, with the originator being Russia, have affected commercial interests as well, especially commercial aviation. And I think that if you like, you can see that commercial aviation and we see this in maritime, as we'll talk about later on, very much tend to be, if you like, collateral. They quite often get affected by nation states' activities, and because of where they go and what they do. And this has been an ongoing problem, especially in the Northern Norway area. Here's another little interesting one, because we talk about drones, and we know that we're seeing more and more drones around, operating remotely and beyond line of visual sight. Here's one that was actually caused by RF interference that happened in the UK, and this is a UK AAIB accident report, so you're welcome to have a read of it after the day. It's an interesting read, and it's interesting that the operators had seen some sort of interference with the satellite navigation system, but they hadn't actually caused any problems. And this time, on the final launch, the drone rose okay, then reported a GPS compass error of some sort, and then it didn't. Then it crashed, and it's quite a heavy drone, as you can see. So it crashed into a house. No one was hurt, but the fact that the drone can fall out of the sky due to some error that's caused by unknown jamming, because no one ever found out the source of the interference, it's quite a thing. Right, a fleet of Chinese fishing vessels accused of misreporting their positions. This is in 2020. And these were ghost ships, if you like, which are falsely reporting locations within New Zealand waters while they fished off the Galapagos Islands. And I'll show you another example of that in a minute. Now, this was not RF spoofing. You can see that this was transmitting false information with their AIS transponders. And that's something we'll talk about a bit later. Maritime I've mentioned as being, along with aviation, a sector where, you know, they suffer the effects of nation state or large scale jamming. And this is a maritime advisory, which is issued by the US. And it's been extended until, it was extended to the 14th of March, may have been extended again. And these are multiple instances highlighted in red of jamming, especially in the eastern and central Mediterranean Sea and the Suez Canal. These have been ongoing problems for a long time. And we'll see that in a little while that some of this interference and jamming has become so routine that users are doing something about it themselves. Again, to highlight the commercial aviation issues with interference. Again, we see, you know, reports that GPS outages are standard occurrences. So again, this is trying to reinforce the fact that, you know, people especially in commercial aviation and maritime, are starting to see routinely problems with GPS disruption, and this is becoming more of an issue, especially, you know, when you talk about aviation. You know, aviation is very conservative about adopting new technology, but increasingly these days, you know, systems are becoming embedded into a lot of dependence. Systems are embedded in aircraft and maritime systems that are dependent on GPS for timing, for example. And that is quite, gives us a problem with kind of cascading failures. And if you want an real world example of that sort of dependency, if you look at the recent problems with the 5G interference on radio altimetry, you can see that actually the radio altimeter data was used in a variety of aircraft systems, which caused a lot of problems. We'll talk a bit more about that in one of the later talks. GPS interference becoming routine. Well, this was one commercial flight crew. They reported that they were so used to experiencing GPS interference from a military installation in the US that when they experienced a course error on one of their flights, they assumed it was this intermittent GPS generated error message and acted accordingly. And in fact, when they landed the aircraft, though, they found out that they had made an error in data entry themselves, and it wasn't GPS jamming, but it was so routine that they acted on it and in error. And again, this is an example that was reported to the US government's navigation center. The users had got so used to experiencing GPS jamming on their vessel that they actually modified the system themselves to defeat any GPS jamming. The outcome was good. It worked. We didn't receive alarms or lose our ECDIS picture. But of course, the fact is that they just acted on their own to try and solve a problem of routine jamming. So we don't really know whether what they did was something that that was correct, or we just know it seemed to work. And it can get worse, actually, even when you know in advance about things. Sometimes people don't act on it. The GPS weak number rollover is a phenomenon that happens because of, if you like, there is a weak number in GPS, and the weak numbers go into a field that's only 10 bits in size. So obviously, that means that every 19.6 years, which is called an epoch in GPS, the weak number resets to 0. So the way to get around it is through software or firmware fixes. And even though everyone knew that this rollover of epochs was coming on April the 6th, 2019, quite often there were people or systems that didn't do anything. And this was quite a big one in the New York City wireless network crashed as a result of one of these issues. And this is, often older receivers that haven't been patched or haven't been maintained, haven't had a cyber checkup. These are the receivers where there were failures, and because of a kind of way you can have, if you like, a rolling window on a GPS week number with a bit of good software engineering, we're expecting more and more of these GPS week number rollovers, even this year and next year. Spoofing AIS data. I showed you something earlier which I thought was spoofed AIS data. This is a real example that was part of Google's Global Phishing Watch. And this is all about the going dark or manipulation of AIS data. If you like, the diagram shows a satellite AIS receiver and its footprint, but you can see it picked up, improbably, two transponder echoes from the Pacific Ocean, just in the red circle. Well, of course, that isn't physically possible. So what it means is that the transmission was originating from within the receiver footprint, but the positions were being reported were incorrect. And so it's obviously some sort of deliberate crime going on. And this is something that, if you like, is very easy to do, because we use, if you like, a protocol called the NMEA 0183, which is the National Marine Electronics Association. And that's the output of a GNSS receiver. Often use that. Some companies and OEMs use their own proprietary standards as well, but NMEA is an accepted output standard. It's unencrypted. It was designed, I think the first NMEA protocol came out in about 1992, and we're now on issue 4.1, which is in 2012. It was designed for slow-moving platforms. It's unencrypted. It's probably, really we shouldn't be using it today. It's very easy to manipulate. And when you look at things like the crop circle spoofing, things like that, although it could be done with RF, we've tried doing it in our labs. It's very difficult to do. But actually, if you manipulated the output of a receiver or injected that output into a ghost output into another system that's open, then you can easily create that sort of track. So to wrap up, and we'll talk about some of this in more detail later on about how to kind of start defending against this. The real world incidents are of disruption to GNSS are rising. And, I think what I've tried to show you is that the incidental or accidental ones are actually more likely than you being deliberately targeted. Someone isn't necessarily going after you as the target, but you'll just happen to be affected by their actions. And we do know that, live sky jamming trials and exercises can cause problems. There's some lessons here which are being learned, definitely in the US, where this has been a big issue. People are learning to make sure that people have got a good way of saying stop if there are any problems. GNSS disruption is becoming routine in some places, and that can cause problems because the users who experience it end up getting into a situation where they do something about it themselves in an uncontrolled way. GNSS RF channels are open backdoors for exploitation, and the weak power of GNSS means it's especially vulnerable. And the other thing is that, these days, GNSS receivers aren't just radios, they're connected devices. So the RF channel is not the only way to cause a problem. And I'll be talking about that again later on as well too. And finally, please join our GNSS vulnerabilities group on LinkedIn, where we're often posting examples of real life commercial sector incidents. Thank you.